Alabama and Arkansas were the final two for Grant Nelson in the transfer portal, and we have an answer with the big fella joining Nate Oats and the Crimson Tide. But was it the right choice? Let's discuss.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I am your host, Andy Patton. We got a jam-packed episode for you today. We're going to talk about Arizona, which they have put together a ridiculous non-conference schedule to counteract a kind of weak Pac-12. It's a trick that Tommy Lloyd learned from his predecessor, Mark Few. We're going to discuss that, as well as former North Carolina commit Simeon Wilcher, who has chosen to join Rick Pitino at St. John's for next season. Before we get into any of that, though, Grant Nelson, North Dakota State big man, the premier player still available in the NCAA transfer portal. He made his decision. He picked the Alabama Crimson Tide and Nate Oats. It came down to Bama and Arkansas. We discussed this on an episode last week, kind of looking at those two options and where he might end up. And ultimately, one of the things that kind of came out of that conversation when looking at the two programs was Alabama had a bigger need. They just had a bigger need and a more obvious fit for Grant Nelson than what Arkansas had available at the time. And so it wasn't a huge shock to see him make this decision. You everyday listeners who checked out Monday's episode with myself and my co-host Isaac Shade, we did our top 10s at this point in the offseason. Neither of us had Alabama in the top 10. I did have Arkansas in the top 10. It was a bit predicated on them potentially landing Grant Nelson. Now that has not happened, we'll have to reevaluate where we have the Hogs going forward. But really, this is about Alabama, and this is about a tremendous talent joining a program that really desperately needed it. We'll talk a little bit about what happened with their offseason, but first a little bit on Nelson for those of you who are maybe not as familiar with his game. He entered the transfer portal at the beginning of May, and throughout the entire process in May, he was pretty adamantly focused on staying in the NBA draft process. He had entered the portal. He said he wasn't going to come back to North Dakota State, but he was focused on not coming back to college at all. Didn't get the feedback that he wanted or needed, or felt that he didn't get the feedback that he needed in order to stay in the draft process. Let's put it that way. I think his performance was a bit up and down at times, but it was clear from the little bits that we saw from him in the combine scrimmages that he probably needs to prove it at a higher level of basketball. And the SEC certainly qualifies for that. He had offers and interest from a variety of schools. Gonzaga was interested, Kentucky was interested, Miami was interested, Florida State was interested. Ultimately, it appeared to come down to a final three between Arkansas, Alabama, and Baylor. Baylor seemed to be somewhat quickly ruled out, and it came down to the two schools there in the SEC, Eric Musselman and the Hogs, Nate Oats and the Crimson Tide. He, of course, chooses to go to Alabama. Numbers last year at North Dakota State, just under 18 points a game, 9.3 rebounds, just over 2 assists, and 1.7 blocks. He was very efficient on 2-point shots, just over 60% from inside the 3-point line, not as efficient outside the 3-point line. In fact, just under 27% from deep for the Bison. That was on about 3 attempts per game. A lot of optimism that 3-point shooting is an area that we will see growth from him in a different offensive set. A 72% free throw shooter, really smooth looking shot. It feels like he's a guy who's going to shoot better than 27% from three when given more of an advanced opportunity. And for Alabama, again, the need wasn't as obvious at the start of the offseason, even when Nelson initially entered the transfer portal, but then they lost Charles Bediako. Bediako chose to stay within the NBA draft process, ending his career after 2 seasons at Alabama. Very talented player, rim runner, efficient low post scorer, very good shot blocker, virtually no outside shot whatsoever. So it was a little bit surprising to see him enter the transfer portal. I'm not sure about his NBA aspirations. We spoke with the great Leaf Tulane of the Locked On NBA Big Board about it, and he had his questions about Bediako's NBA future as well. But it created an even bigger need for Alabama in the front court than they previously had. And they'd already known that Noah Clowney was gone. He's entering the NBA draft process. There was never any real mystery about that. Noah Gurley also out the door after a tremendous 5-year college basketball career. Of course, Brandon Miller, never any mystery there. Doesn't really play the same position, but is 6'9". And so we're talking about 3 players in Clowney, Gurley, and Miller, 6'9" or taller, who all left Alabama. And then Bediako does, of course, the 7-footer. So now you have 4 bigs. Again, Miller's not really playing the big, but 4 bigger guys all leaving your program, and you don't really have reinforcements coming in. You retain Nick Pringle. And Nick Pringle, again, for those of you who listened to the episode I did with Leaf a few weeks ago talking about Bediako, part of that conversation was this belief that Nick Pringle is a player who is going to emerge as a potential breakout candidate in the SEC. Like Leaf mentioned, thinking he could be a guy who's in the NBA after this season. Like he's got that kind of talent in him. And that's part of the reason that maybe Bediako did decide to leave, and part of the reason that Alabama wasn't in a huge rush to fill some of these holes. But you still need more than just Nick Pringle. And they do bring in 2 4-star prospects in the class of 2023, and Sam Walters, who's ranked 57th at 24/7 Sports, Muhammad Diubate, who's ranked 109th. He's 6'7", Walters is 6'8". So you're still not bringing in a ton of size there. So Nelson is a guy who comes in. He gives you that size at 6'11". He can play the 5. He can play the small ball 4, or not really small ball 4, I suppose. He could play stretch 4 role for Alabama. He joins a really, really solid portal class that they have coming in with Aaron Estrada, a multiple 20-point per game scorer at Hofstra. He joins them via the transfer portal. Latrell Wrightsell comes from Cal State Fullerton, another guy who is making a big jump from the Big West to the SEC, but a player who should be a big-time contributor for Nate Oats' team. So this is a really great overall transfer portal class. And I think for a team that was really short on front court talent, adding a player who not only provides that size, has shown shot blocking ability in the past, but a guy who can really stretch the defense. And again, there's some question about whether that ability translates because it wasn't really there even at North Dakota State in the Summit League last year. But for Nate Oats' offense, this is kind of a great player to have. This offense is predicated on 3-pointers or shots around the rim. That's what we're doing. No mid-range. We want to space the floor, take a lot of outside shots, let our guards get downhill and go towards the basket. Grant Nelson possesses the skills necessary to thrive in that kind of offense. And I think when you boil it down to that, that's a really big factor here. Arkansas had really big issues with floor spacing last year. They brought in an entire new group of players, and hopefully Eric Musselman and the staff will kind of figure out a way to fix some of those issues. But if floor spacing was going to be a problem for Grant Nelson at Arkansas, I could see the appeal of saying, well, screw that. I'm just going to go to Alabama where there's more room, there's more space, there's more of a need for me and my skill set. Again, Arkansas has a need for a front court player. They're going to probably turn their attention to Jordan Brown, who's transferring out, a grad transfer out of Louisiana, guy who started his career at Nevada in the 2018-19 season when they were coached by Eric Musselman. So that makes a lot of sense for him to potentially end up going there. Jordan Brown would be a fantastic addition for the Hogs. I believe there's a very good chance we hear that in the coming days. And if so, you'd still rather have Grant Nelson. I think he's a more well-rounded player. He's a more offensive threat than Jordan Brown. But if you land a guy like Jordan Brown for Arkansas, I think you feel pretty good about that. I think you feel okay with where you're at, considering all of the guards they've brought in, Menefield and El Ellis and everybody else who's coming into that program for Arkansas. But again, tough for them to not get Grant Nelson. This would have been the feather in the cap of what's already been a very, very good portal offseason for Eric Musselman and the Hogs. But I don't think it's a huge problem for them, especially if they do go out and get Jordan Brown. But for Alabama, this is a really nice kind of likely finish to their offseason. Lost a lot of talent, aren't bringing in a recruiting class nearly as elite as last year's recruiting class, added a few nice guards in the transfer portal, but kind of needed that big to really push them over the top again, especially after Bediako's decision to leave. And now they have that guy in Grant Nelson. The biggest question I have about Grant Nelson in the SEC and at Alabama, how does that rim protection skill translate? To me, until we know what that looks like, it's hard to fully judge this decision, because I don't think Grant Nelson's going to be as efficient of a low post scorer as Charles Bediako, but he is going to provide much more floor spacing, more ball handling ability, better free throw shooting. The question then is, can he be at least adequate on the defensive end of the floor? Is he going to be as good as Bediako? Almost certainly not. And that's not even a knock on Nelson as much as Bediako is a very, very good defensive player. Is Nelson going to average 1.7 blocks per game? I don't think so. But can he be an adequate rim protector in the SEC? Can he prevent some of those really talented guards from getting downhill and scoring with ease? Is he going to be a player who gets in a lot of foul trouble because he's adjusting to a different speed in the SEC? Like, these are questions that we won't have answers to until we're in the middle of the season. But if Grant Nelson can prove that he can play on the defensive end of the floor at that level while maintaining that offensive skill set that he possesses, this is a tremendous addition for Nate Oats. If he struggles on defense, it's still a solid addition for what it does to their offense, opening it up, but it does create a bit more of an issue where he's maybe not as playable at the end of games, or certain matchups just aren't as good for him, and that could cause some problems for this team, especially with their depth having been a little bit hit in the front court. Even with the addition of Nelson, they still got some depth concerns in that front court. All right, well, Simeon Wilcher became the second highest rated recruit to join the entire Big East Conference this season after he decommits from North Carolina and picks Rick Pitino and St. John's. More on that connection after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel because right now new customers get a no sweat first bet of up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet does not win. Maybe you like what you're hearing about Alabama right now and you want to make a future bet for them to win the SEC or advance deep into the NCAA tournament, something Nate Oats is really clamoring to do this year. I love betting with FanDuel because they have great promotions literally every single day. The app is safe, it is secure, and it is super easy to use, and you get paid instantly. There is no better place to bet all of the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no sweat first bet of up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day. For those of you joining us on YouTube, we appreciate all of you everyday listeners. We got more coming your way later this week. We're going to talk to our friend Leaf Tulane about some NBA draft prospects that he is higher on than consensus. So if you are a fan of some of those players or a fan of an NBA team looking to find a steal in the draft, definitely check out Wednesday's episode. And then my co-host Isaac Shade will bring it home Thursday and Friday as we get closer and closer to the NBA draft. And of course, continue to look at all the different transfer portal things that are happening across the college basketball landscape. Right now, though, I want to talk about Simeon Wilcher. We talked about him briefly on Monday's episode during our weekly six-pack on Monday in our final segment. For those of you who missed those Monday shows, definitely check them out. They're the most fun shows of the week. It's Isaac and I getting a chance to talk about all the stuff that happened over the weekend. One of the things we touched on in that final segment on Monday was Simeon Wilcher decommitting from North Carolina and kind of what that meant for them, why he chose to do it. And we mentioned in that one that St. John's seemed like they were kind of the primary spot that he was expected to end up landing. It took less than 24 hours after that podcast was published for Simeon Wilcher to announce that he was committing to Rick Pitino and St. John's. He's the number 46 ranked player in the class of 2023 per 24/7 Sports. He's number 34 in their composite rankings, so a lot of the other sites like him even more than 24/7 Sports. It still has him as a top 50 prospect in that class. He is the biggest or most notable high school recruit since Pitino took over, which is kind of a dubious distinction since Rick Pitino only took over the team in March, and they have only added 2 high schoolers since then. Simeon Wilcher and Brady Dunlap are the 2 players there. But he's also the second highest rated recruit in the entire Big East for the class of 2023. Obviously, the Big East, a tremendous basketball conference, not typically known for being the pinnacle of recruiting. That typically goes to schools like Kentucky and Duke and Michigan State and Kansas and so on and so forth. But for the Big East, like, Wilcher is one of the more premier freshmen joining the conference. The number 1 player in the Big East joining the conference next year is Stephon Castle at UConn, but Wilcher is now second, again, coming in at number 46 on 24/7 Sports. He's from New Jersey, so there was an obvious geographical connection to potentially joining Rick Pitino at St. John's, but really the story is him decommitting from North Carolina, because this news came very quickly after Elliot Cadeau, who's one of the top-ranked players, who was in the class of 2024. Cadeau, somewhat unsurprisingly, there had been rumblings that this was going to happen. Cadeau finally made it official. He reclassified for the class of 2023, and he is joining Hubert Davis and the Tar Heels this season. Really big addition for them. Of course, they have RJ Davis coming back after a very solid start to his career at North Carolina. They added Cormac Ryan out of the transfer portal from Notre Dame, and now they have Cadeau stepping into a bigger role. And Wilcher ultimately decided that he would rather play somewhere else. And I'm going to use a phrase specifically coined by Armando Bacot on Twitter, who described what Wilcher did as, quote, running from the grind. And look, it is rare to see, not super rare, but it is somewhat rare to see players taking pretty obvious shots at players for decommitting or transferring or anything like that. Wilcher and Bacot were not teammates. They ostensibly, I don't know how much interaction they have or have ever had with each other. It would be different if a player, you'd spent 2 years next to a guy and then he hit the transfer portal and then you took a shot at him on social media. That would be a bigger story, but it is interesting to see that the North Carolina players aren't necessarily happy with this decision. And at the end of the day, it's kind of hard to argue with Bacot's point. And I'm not going to sit here and trash a high school kid. I have no interest in doing that whatsoever. There could have been 1,000 reasons, 100,000 reasons why he would want to end up going to St. John's instead of going to North Carolina. But the timing doesn't look great. It looks like he didn't want to attempt to have to compete for playing time with another player in Elliot Cadeau. Now he goes to St. John's. I would love to see if we could get Carolina and St. John's to play each other, because boy, that might be some pretty fun. But what I have no idea about is how much Simeon Wilcher is going to play for Rick Pitino's team, because this is the most difficult team in all of college basketball by a pretty significant margin in terms of projecting what the heck things are going to look like next year, because it is an entirely new team. And we say that somewhat derisively when we're talking about teams that have, turned over 3 or 4 or 5 different players or whatever. But St. John's, this is the 12th newcomer. 12th. You have 13 scholarships on a roster. 12 new players are joining the Johnnies this year, including the 2 freshmen in Dunlap and Wilcher, and then 10, count them, 10 transfers. I am not going to list every single one of the players joining the program out of the transfer portal. The most notable ones are Jordan Dingle, one of the highest level scorers at mid-major last year, coming over from Penn. Naheem Aline joining the team. It's always interesting to see Big East to Big East transfers. We've seen a handful of those. Aline coming, of course, from UConn. He was a big part of the bench unit for Danny Hurley's team last year. Dennis Jenkins joins from Iona. Of course, not surprising to see Rick Pitino pick up one of the best players from his Iona team and bring them with him to St. John's. RJ Lewis from UMass and then Glenn Taylor Jr. from Oregon State are just a few of the big name players who are coming over from the transfer portal to join Pitino at St. John's. And then, of course, if you got 12 new guys coming in, as you can probably imagine, there's not a whole lot of guys sticking around. 11 players have entered the transfer portal out of St. John's. Basically everybody. Again, the highlights: David Jones has gone over to Memphis. Dylan Adewasu goes to Seton Hall, again, staying in that conference. Andre Curbelo goes to Southern Mississippi. Posh Alexander stays in the Big East as well and goes to Butler. AJ Storr goes to Wisconsin. Again, just a few of the players that are leaving the conference. And it's going to be fascinating. I mean, it's going to be one of the most fascinating teams to watch in all of college basketball next year, and one of the most interesting teams to watch that wasn't very good the year before. Like, I'm very excited to watch Kansas next year, because adding Hunter Dickinson and adding Nick Timberlake and bringing Kevin McCullough back is really, really fun. I'm excited to watch Marquette with a similar roster, Purdue, FAU bringing back their starting lineups. Duke brings back a lot of the same guys. Like, those are the teams that were consistently showing up in the top 5, top 10 for next season. I'm excited to see teams like Gonzaga, who of course are, have a very new look starting lineup for next year, but bring in some really talented players like Ryan Nembhard. But St. John's was not good last year. I'm not sure if they're going to be good this year. They're probably going to be better, but they're going to be really fun to watch. Because the starting lineup could be Jordan Dingle is going to start. That's pretty much what we know. There are probably a handful of other spots that are pretty well secure right now. But with a brand new coach who's bringing in a new system, albeit a system that many people are familiar with because Rick Pitino has been coaching for a very, very long time. But he's going to bring in a new system. He's going to bring in a bunch of new talent. Some of these guys are going to adjust really well to his coaching style. Some of these guys might not adjust super well to his coaching style. It's going to be interesting to see how all of that shakes out. In terms of the Wilcher of it all, I suspect he will play. Most top 50 prospects play in their first year of college basketball. Most players who are committed to go to North Carolina who end up going somewhere else are probably going to end up playing somewhere. He didn't decommit from North Carolina to go somewhere else and not play. Let's put it that way. But I'm not exactly sure what his role is going to look like. And anybody who tells you they are is probably lying to you unless it is Rick Pitino himself, because it's just hard to project. It's always hard to project, not elite freshmen. Usually the top 10, top 15, maybe even top 20 guys, you can generally expect, hey, they're going to play big minutes right away. But once you get outside of that group, it's a lot murkier. And for on a St. John's roster that has virtually nobody returning from last year, it's really going to be kind of chaotic to see how this all shakes out, what it all looks like. I'm very excited to see what St. John's looks like. I will say that Gary Parrish at CBS, he released his 25+1 rankings that he does. His +1 team, so 26 in his rankings, was St. John's. So they are starting to get some of that top 5 attention, or top 25 attention, top 25 love. I'll be honest with you, I'm not ready to put him there yet because I just am not sure what this is all going to look like. But I wouldn't be shocked if Pitino, an elite coach back in the Big East for the first time in a really long time, if he gets this team back into that conversation by the end of the year. It wouldn't shock me at all if he can figure out how to put all these pieces together and build a roster that can contend in the mighty, mighty Big East that has 3 top 10 teams by my count in Marquette, UConn, and Creighton, at least at this point in the offseason. If you can get this team back into that conversation at all, man, that would be a tremendous coaching job for a coach who's had a lot of tremendous coaching jobs throughout his career. We're going to close out the show discussing Arizona's loaded, and I mean loaded, non-conference schedule, what it says about Tommy Lloyd's confidence or lack thereof in the Pac-12 conference. More on all that coming up right after this. All right, folks, closing out the show, talking about Tommy Lloyd and the Arizona Wildcats as they recently added Purdue, Matt Painter's Boilermakers, Zach Edey's Boilermakers to their non-conference schedule. They will play them on December 16th at Gainbridge Fieldhouse, the home of the Indiana Pacers. So it is a neutral site game, but man, it is not much of a neutral site game. Again, you see these matchups crop up all the time. Gonzaga plays teams in Seattle regularly. They played Alabama in Birmingham this last year. It is not uncommon to play Duke in the Madison Square Garden, for example. Like, there are a lot of games that show up like this on the calendar. But for Arizona to add Purdue, to be willing to play Purdue in Indiana at Gainbridge Fieldhouse, that's a really fun game. And just looking at that game specifically, we'll talk a little bit more about Arizona's entire schedule, but what a fun matchup. I mean, for starters, you have a really, really traditional back to the basket big battle between Zach Edey, of course, the returning National Player of the Year, expected to be a front runner, I should say, for National Player of the Year again this upcoming season, going up against Umar Ballo, a player who's been excellent since transferring from Gonzaga to Arizona. Follow his coach, Tommy Lloyd, there. He's been a player who's really emerged as an all Pac-12 caliber center and a really good defensive player, a big physical guy, one of the few players in college basketball I think can really single-handedly move Zach Edey around. It's not going to be easy. Nobody has done it easily, but Ballo's the kind of guy who could potentially do that. So you look on paper, you see inconsistent guard play with some of these teams. We saw that with Purdue last year. We saw that with Arizona last year. They bring in Jaden Bradley and Caleb Love, who are guys who are a little bit inconsistent, and you think, hey, this looks like kind of a similar matchup between these two teams on paper, but their play style, very different. Last year, Purdue was 324th in pace. Arizona was 13th. So you're going to see one team that's trying to get out and go and go and go and get in transition and have a lot of possessions and score a lot of points, and one team that's trying to slow you way down, that's trying to pound the ball in the paint, that's taking a lot more time. It's going to be kind of an unstoppable force, immovable object type of game, and one that I'm really excited to throw on that day, December 16th, and watch these two teams duke it out. Speaking of Duke, that's another team that Arizona's got on their schedule. They have, again, we talked about this ridiculous non-conference schedule for the Wildcats. They're going to play Duke on the road and not Madison Square Garden, on the road. They're going to Cameron Indoor Stadium to play against the Cameron Crazies. The most exciting part of this game, it is an early November game, so it is one of the first games of the season. Caleb Love returns to Cameron Indoor as a member of the Arizona Wildcats. They are going to let him have it in that game. Of course, Caleb Love basically ended Coach K's career by hitting a game-winning shot for North Carolina in that NCAA tournament a few years back. So not going to be Duke's favorite player by any stretch of the imagination. No love lost, for lack of a better term, at Cameron Indoor for Caleb Love's return for Arizona in that game. It's going to be an absolute blast to watch that. But you got Tommy Lloyd's lining up Duke early in the season at Cameron, a true road game against the Blue Devils. He's lined up Michigan State in Palm Springs, so admittedly a bit of an advantage for them there. Lined up Alabama in Phoenix. Again, that's a bit more of a neutral site that benefits Arizona type game, but let's run through that again real quick. Purdue, Duke, Michigan State, and Alabama. We just released, again, for those of you everyday listeners who checked out Monday's show, we had Purdue and Duke and Michigan State in the top five. Top five. That's 3 top 5 programs right there by our count here in mid-June as we look ahead to the college basketball season. Of course, that might change, but those 3 teams are going to be good next year. Whether we still have them in our top 5, top 10, even drop down a little bit, perhaps, if some roster things happen between now and then, those are still 3 of the best teams in college basketball. And Arizona's taken all of them on, as well as Alabama, who we did not have in our top 5. We did not have them in our top 10, but they would be in my top 15. And at this point, after adding Grant Nelson, they're a borderline top 10 team. If you have them in your top 10 right now with Grant Nelson, I would understand that argument. I think that is a reasonable place to have Alabama at this stage in the offseason. So now you're looking at a schedule for Arizona that potentially has 4 top 10 teams on it. And look, I mentioned this at the onset. He learned this from somebody. Tommy Lloyd learned this from Mark Few. He worked under Mark Few for 20 years at Gonzaga. And Mark Few, it took him a while because teams were unwilling to play them for a long, long, long time. And they had to scratch and claw and fight and get as many tournaments as they could and find whatever coaches would be willing to play them. And they had to do that forever till they finally got to the point that they're at now, where they play Baylor and Kentucky and Alabama and Michigan State and Purdue and Texas. I mean, that's all those teams I just listed. They played them last year. Like, that's not over the course of the last 5 years. They played all those teams last year. They played Duke regularly. They've played North Carolina in the kennel. Like, they play as many good teams as they possibly can. And Gonzaga knows they have to do that because of the WCC. The Pac-12 and the WCC are not the same. I don't want anybody to be jumping down my throat about that. They're not the same. The Pac-12 top to bottom is a better conference than the WCC. But the spread is not that big. And I will happily say that. The difference between the Pac-12 and the WCC is minimal at best. And Tommy Lloyd is aware of that. And he knows what it takes to build a tough non-conference schedule. And he knows how impactful that is for building your brand, which Arizona doesn't really need, but also building your resume. Look, Arizona's probably not going to get shafted the way that Gonzaga 10 years ago might have for not having a super strong non-conference schedule. But it can't hurt. It can't hurt not just from a scheduling perspective, but it's also not going to hurt you just from a getting our team better perspective. If you believe that playing Oregon State twice and Cal twice and Washington twice and Washington State twice and Utah twice, if you believe that all 10 of those games aren't doing much for you, which there's a reasonable argument to say that they're not, make sure you get that Duke game, get that Purdue game, get that Michigan State game. Like, go get those games, because you're going to have some slogs in the regular season. And I'm curious how this is going to continue to go for Arizona, because, of course, they're very involved in conversations with the Big 12. But if they do not move, if they stay in the Pac-12, everybody looks at it from a football perspective. Oh, Pac-12 keeps Arizona football. That's fine. But it is a desperate need for them to keep Arizona from a basketball perspective. But if you're Arizona and you're looking around when USC and UCLA are out the door, you're going to say, who the heck are we playing every day? Are they going to add San Diego State? Cool, that helps. What if they don't? What if it's Arizona head and shoulders above Oregon and Colorado? Arizona State? Like, this things could get kind of ugly for Arizona in the Pac-12 if they choose to stay and other teams choose to leave. Or, of course, we know USC and UCLA are out the door. If Pac-12 doesn't make any other additions, Arizona is going to be kind of on an island. Is it going to be quite this? Is it going to be exactly the same as Gonzaga in the WCC? No, but it's not that far off. It is not as far off as people think. And part of that is that the WCC is just better than people think that it is. And I will die on that hill adamantly, even if people refuse to believe it. But the top 5 of the WCC, Gonzaga, St. Mary's, Santa Clara, LMU, San Francisco, whatever it may be, losing BYU hurts there. But It's not dramatically different. It's really not. And then you get to the bottom. Yeah, the bottom feeders in the WCC are bad, but guess what? So are Cal and Oregon State. We'll see if Cal looks better. They got 9 new players coming in. They got a new coach in Mark Madsen. I'm optimistic that the Golden Bears might turn things around with Dawes Amack and some of the other players they brought in. But it's been pretty rough at the bottom of the Pac-12. And for Tommy Lloyd to see that, recognize that, and know, hey, I got 20 years of experience watching my old boss do this and navigate this at Gonzaga, and he figured out how to do it for himself. And I'm very excited to see how Arizona is going to look in the early part of the season, where they're still going to be figuring some stuff out, and it might be a little rocky, but it's going to be a lot of fun to see them iron out those kinks against teams like Duke and Purdue and Michigan State. All right, folks, that is going to do it for us today. Great conversation coming your way on Wednesday's episode with Leif Tulin of the Locked On NBA Big Board. Very excited for that. So don't miss out on that. You can simply do that by hitting that subscribe button on YouTube. Follow us on social media if you don't already. Leave us a review on iTunes. That is very much appreciated. Again, more fantastic stuff coming your way later this week, including that conversation with Leif. For now, though, peace out.